Hello, the internet. My name is Dean, and welcome back to another Ruby on Rails tutorial. This is week 15 of the 20 and 20 challenge, if you can believe it. Today, we're going to be taking a look at creating a Vue project. So we're going to be creating a Vue to-do list, similar to the React and the JavaScript ones. I'm sure I'll have links in the cards as the video progresses for those tutorials if you're interested. But instead of using just React or JavaScript, today we're going to be taking a look at Vue, and we're going to be using a Rails 6 API for the backend. We're going to version our API. We're going to make sure that the API only responds to requests from the Vue project, and the Vue project will run on its own port, and it will make Axios requests. So unlike with the React project from week 5, I believe, or the JavaScript project from week 4, we've gradually been building up. And today we're going to be using Axios calls. So what does that mean? Instead of using just complete from the bare bones HTTP requests like we did in the JavaScript app, or using fetch requests like we did in the React app, today we're going to be using Axios calls, which means we just pass in a URL and we say, get me the thing, and it will get the thing. So Axios will simplify our lives quite a bit. But we're also going to be using Vuex. And Vuex is a store, so this allows you to have a state management system in your Vue application. This is similar to Redux from React, and I guess a lot of array management in vanilla JavaScript. So we're using Vuex 4, we're using Vue 3. These are new tools. That means you're going to be seeing some differences from what you're used to in your regular Vue 2 projects with Vuex 3. So that means that So that's a lot to digest, but hopefully by following these steps, you'll be able to make some headway. But hopefully by following these steps, you'll be well on your way to creating Vue 3 projects using Vuex 4, some of the most cutting edge technology we have right now in terms of front-end frameworks. And of course, setting up the Rails portion of this tutorial will take all of maybe 5 to 10 minutes. Because a lot of it we've already done before on this channel, and the commands are fairly simple. You add a gem, you edit your cores to say this port, you version your API by creating an API folder with a version for your controller, you add in the version and API hook, or you add in the version and API namespace to your controller, and then you update your routes, and then you're pretty much done. It's that simple to set up the Rails portion. So the vast majority of this tutorial will cover the Vue, Vuex, and Axios parts. So that's enough for me. Before we get started, I just want to mention that the channel has a Discord. It does have some Patreon roles. So for the people that are Patreon subscribers, you do have access to custom roles in the Discord. For those of you that aren't Patreon supporters, though, you still get access to the help of the whole community in the Discord. So if you're stuck on anything in this video or anything Rails related or even programming related in general, you can just drop in a question and someone, probably not me because everyone else here is far better at answering these questions, but someone will probably get back to you with a response almost immediately. So if that's something you're interested in, check the pinned comment. I will have a link to the Discord in the top level comment. But that's enough for me. Let's go ahead and let's jump into some code. Okay, so this is just a look at the application we're going to be creating today. Now this is, of course, based on a Traversy Media tutorial. Where he showed off how to make a Vue application. So this should look familiar if you've seen that. I'll have a link to that tutorial in the description if that's something you're interested in, because he'll probably explain a lot of this more in depth than I will, because I'm trying to just show how to tie together a Vue app or a to-do list app in Vue with the backend in Rails. I'm not really here to cover all of the basics of Vue, so we're going to be moving a little bit faster in this video. But the basic premise is, instead of using just a dummy online JSON store to post your stuff and mock up a response, we're actually going to be using this Rails app that I have running here. So this one's running on localhost port 3000. So if I were to go to localhost port 3000, you can see that this is a Rails app that's running here. And this is actually communicating with it. So if I come over here and I delete one of these to-do list items, you'll see down here that it just deleted it. If I refresh the page, it'll stay gone. So I can make another item. I can hit enter. And now let's say I only want to filter like 5 of the to-do items. Then you'll see that there's only 5 that appear here. And maybe we finish number 5 so we can double click it and set it as completed. You can see down here all of these actions are firing off API requests to the API, which updates the database, and then it sends back a response. And then the Vue app says, okay, well, gotcha. You got it, boss. I'll update appropriately. But okay, so that's it for the opening demo. Let's go ahead and let's get started. Let me just close out both of these. So for this one, we have a front end and a back end to create, and I'm just going to arbitrarily choose which one we do. So let's start with the back end, I guess. So let's make the Rails app. So for this, let's say Rails new to do, or I guess we could even just call it backend, right? So we'll just say Rails new backend. We'll hit enter. Oops, we won't do that. rm-rf backend. We'll say Rails new backend -- API. There we go. That's what we want to run. So that'll run the generator in API mode, which will not generate our views. So if we come into our app, we won't have any real views here. And it only does the like middleware backend stuff we need. It doesn't do any of the front end stuff. So that's good. But now we need to come into our gem file. And let me just bump up the size here to make sure you can see. But in our gem file, there is going to be a cores gem that I can never find right here, line 26. And we're just going to uncomment that. We can then run a bundle command. Oops. We can cd into our backend folder, and then we can run a bundle install command. That will install this gem. Of course, I already have it installed, so that's not an issue. And then we can come into our config, and we should have, I think, an initializers cores.rb file, which is this one right here. And then if I uncomment this, we'll now have this cores rack running here. And then if I come over to my other screen and I make sure I have the right cores thing, for this tutorial, I am referencing a text tutorial on Deanin.com. I don't know if that'll be available as soon as this video goes up, but you know, if you're watching this in the future, there will be a text version of this tutorial available on Deanin.com. But okay, we're going to be running our Rails server in localhost port 3000 is the Rails server. That doesn't matter for this configuration. That'll matter for the front end when it tries to communicate with the API. But the API needs to know that the localhost port 8080 is the front end, which means that in here, when we say allow origins, instead of example.com, we want to allow http://localhost port 8080. And that will allow our front end to communicate with our Rails app. Okay, now what we can do is we can come over to our terminal and we'll just run a Rails G scaffold command. We will we'll create our to-dos. And then we need to say, what does each to-do have? Well, it'll have an ID by default, which we'll pass in from the front end. It'll have a title of type string, which will be this text right here. And then it will also need a completed Boolean, which is what happens when you double click one of these items. So I think that's it. This filter to-dos will not persist. So when you refresh the application, it will go back to a default value of 200. You could, of course, make this persist, but you wouldn't be storing this in your to-dos model anyways. You'd want to store this in a separate like config model or something. But okay, let's go ahead and let's generate our scaffold for the to-dos. Go ahead and generate that. Then we can say Rails db:/migrate to migrate the database. And then let's go ahead and come over to our config and routes.rb. We have our resources to-dos here. Let's go ahead and let's scope this into our API namespace. So we can say namespace, API do, end. And then we also want namespace v1 do, end. And then we can move our resources in there, which means now you'll have to go to localhost port 3000/API/v1/to-dos to access our to-dos route. But down the road, maybe we have a second, version of the API and we want the old one to still work for people. Then we just create another namespace for v2 and we have another controller, which is why we're doing this. It's sort of, to production proof yourself for future growing. It's of course not necessary for if you're just creating a small application for yourself. But the whole point of this tutorial series is to learn, and sometimes learning means doing things that don't really make sense in the context of a small application, but that's what the exercises are for. Get you ready for industry. So, okay, let's come into our controllers and let's create these folders for these namespaces. So the first one we'll create is just a folder called API. Then inside of that folder, we'll create another one. We'll say V1. And inside of V1, that is where we want our to-dos controller to be. So we'll just drag the to-dos controller into here, and then we'll go ahead and we'll open it up. So what does the to-dos controller need to look like? Well, first thing we need to do up here is say this class is API : V1 : to-dos controller. That takes care of that. Now for the index, instead of just returning to-dos all, what we probably want to do is we'll say, to-dos all, but if you give me a limit from our parameters, so we'll say limit equals params, then underscore limit, so we'll just pass in underscore limit. So then if limit dot present, and this is just checking if it's making sure it's not empty and that it's not nil. So if there is a limit, then we want the limit to be cast to an int. And then after we cast it to an int, we then want to say our @todos are equal to @todos dot last, and then the limit. So if our limit's present, we just reassign our to-dos. Then at the end here, we want to return the reverse of these so that our newest items appear first. And we don't want to do it at the top because, of course, here where we're reassigning it, it would be in the wrong order. So we do want to make sure that our reverse happens at the end. Next thing we want to do, I'll go ahead and I'll save the controller. We want to come down here to our to-do params. So we have to-do.permit. That's fine. We do need to permit an ID. We have our title, our completed, and we have our underscore limit. And I just like to make sure all of these things are explicitly defined before I get started, usually just so that, I can come in here and be like, what am I looking for? ID, title, completed, ID, limit. Okay, cool. I know I need those things. It's not normally something I worry about in a Rails application, but when I'm, creating an API, it's something that I do consider. So now that this is done, let's go ahead and let's run Rails S, and then let's navigate to localhost port 3000. That works. Let's try /API/v1/todos. And here we can see that we have an uninitialized constant API. Now, why do we have that? Oh, it's because in here, I called this all caps API instead of lowercase API. If I change that, now our request is working as expected. And at this point, that is basically it for the backend. So, now we can just sort of leave this in the back and just move on with our lives. Of course, in another terminal, what we can do is we can cd into our backend real quick, go to Rails C, then we can say @todo equals new to-do. Oops, equals to-do.new. Sorry, I'm working in the wrong language here. Then we can say @todo.title equals hello world. @todo.completed equals false. @todo.save. There we go. That saves it. Now let's come over here, refresh, and we now have one item being returned. See, the title is hello world, ID is 1, completed is false, and this is our created at and updated at time. So, okay. That takes care of essentially the entire backend. How do we deal with the front end now? Okay, so the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make sure that we have the Vue CLI installed. So for this, let me just, I think what you need to do is you need to say like npm install -g @vue/CLI. But okay, let's assume you have the Vue CLI installed. We then want to say Vue create and then our project name. So for this, I'll just call it front end and then I'll hit enter. Now I do have a couple defaults here, but instead we're just going to manually select some features. What I want for this is I want to say this uses Vuex and I want to do some unit testing. And for the rest of this, I'll leave the same options and I'll hit enter. Then I'll come down here and I'm hitting space to select in the previous menu, by the way. Here, I'm just going to hit enter on 3.x to say preview it. And then I'll say I want ESLint plus prettier. So I'll hit enter on that. I'll say lint and fix on commit and I'll hit space. So both of these are selected. I'll hit enter, and then I'll use Jest as the testing framework. Then I'll say I want dedicated config files for each. And I'll say, sure, save this as a preset. And then I'll say this is my YouTube Vue 3 preset with Vuex and Jest. And then I'll hit enter. And then that will go ahead and generate the project for us. Okay, and right here we can see it tells us to cd into our front end and then run npm run serve. Let's go ahead and cd into our front end. I just realized I generated this in the backend file, so I'm going to go ahead and set this up in the right directory. So I'll be back in a second. Okay, so now that I'm in the right directory, what I'm going to do at the video level here, so let me just bump up the screen size real quick. I'll say view create front end. And then it's once again going to ask me for the options here. So I'll go through this again just so you can see it. This is my preset here. I could click this, but instead I'll say manually select. And then I'll say Vuex, and I want unit testing, and then I'll hit enter. 3.0 is the preview. ESL plus prettier, lint on save, and lint on commit. And then I want Jest as the unit test framework, dedicated config, and I'm going to hit no for the preset this time because I already have these options. And then I'm going to generate it again, and this time I'll actually see the front end folder appear, which probably should have tipped me off before. But now I'll see you after the loading screen. Okay, so now I'll just collapse the backend folder. Oops, I'll collapse the backend folder, leave the front end open. I'll cd into our front end folder, and then I'll run npm run serve to try and open the application. And this will host it on port 8080 right here. So if I come over to my other tab, I already have this open, but of course when I refresh this, it'll go to a blank Vue application, which is this one over here. And then let's just go ahead and let's quickly take a look at what this Vue application is actually doing for us. So over here we have our test folder, which has an example spec in it, and all this does is it tests a hello world component. This, so it says, you know, it renders a message when passed, and then it creates the message, mounts the component, passes in the props message, and then it expects the wrapper.text to match the message, which is just a way of saying, you know, if I pass this component a parameter, it should do things with the parameter, and then I expect the things text to be whatever I told it the text should be. So it's just making sure that this is accepting props and using them properly. In this case, it's a very simple example. If we come into source, components, hello world.view, it's just whatever this is right here. And then of course in our app.view, we're passing a message saying, welcome to your Vue.js app, which is this text right here. And all the example spec is doing is it's just saying, if I pass you a message, does it appear right here? Which of course you can see by checking, but it's always better if you have tests that do this because you won't always be checking every piece of functionality to make sure it still works. And if you just have some tests running in the background, you can always, you know, just have everything that you have tested be tested whenever you make a change, and you're constantly doing this without needing to manually test it. But how do we actually run these tests? We can stop the server for now, and I think I can run npm run test :unit, maybe, to run our unit tests. And it looks like that worked. We have one passed, one total. I'm still sort of new to Vue, so I apologize. But the other thing we can do is we can say npm run test :unit, and then I think it's space dash dash. Let me just bump up the size a bit more. Oh, I guess I can't. Npm run test :unit space dash dash space dash dash watch. I don't know why that's the command, but if you run that command, it'll open up a sort of a constant feedback loop like this, where you can just say A, run all my tests, W to show more, and then you can say, you know, maybe I make a change to this, and I want to make sure that when I say welcome to my app, that this still passes the test. So, you know, whatever this message is, it still renders it on the screen as expected. Of course, this isn't updating because the server's not running, but you get the idea. So that's sort of how you can test it, and then you would have multiple it-do blocks in here, similar to the RSpec tutorial we did the other day. So you could have another one where it's like, it says, welcome to the app or something, and then you would just write another test here. And we can just do this real quick. And then, this one also just runs. And you have 2 passing because this one doesn't actually assert anything. But okay, that's enough about testing for now. What else do we have? It also created a store for us because we added Vuex. So we have an index.js here, which is creating a store. And we have our app.vue, of course, which has all of this in it. Our hello world.vue, which we already looked at, which has everything on this screen here. And our main.js, which just creates the app, tells it to use a store, and then it mounts the app. So I think the first thing we probably want to do here is let's go ahead and let's get rid of this hello world component. So we'll delete this. We'll delete the component. And now what you can see on this side here is that we have a test failing. So the component doesn't exist, and the test is telling us, hey, I can't do this. So let's come into our test. Because we deleted that component, we can also just get rid of this test. Now we don't have any failing tests. Let's exit out of this and we'll run npm run serve again. And then we can refresh this. Of course, now we're getting other failures. So the first failure we're getting is we're trying to import this hello world component, which no longer exists. So we don't need this import statement. We don't have a component in here. We can just go ahead and save that. Now we have some other issues with linting, stuff like that. So what do we need to do inside of our app.vue? Well, our main is good because it's already just creating the app. So the rest of this is going to happen in the app.vue. And let's start by, I guess, working with the template. So up here, we're going to create a div with an ID of app. Then we're going to say this has a class container inside, container inside of it. And then we can say this has a h1, which says to-do list manager. Right there, that appears on the screen. Then it also has a h6. H6. And the h6 just says, this app is powered by Vue, Vuex4, so we can actually say Vue 3. So we're specifying versions, I guess. Axios, I don't know what version. Ruby on Rails 6, and SQLite 3. We can save that, which gives us our text right here. Very neat, very fancy. And then below this, what we'll want is we'll probably want to create a couple components. But first, let's go ahead and let's update our style down here. We'll get rid of this app one, and instead we'll just say, give the body some style. Say this has a font family, and we'll say Franklin Gothic medium, comma, Arial narrow, comma, Arial. Bump up the size a bit more. Probably also move this over a little bit just so you guys can see a bit more. Okay, so we have Arial, and then we also have sans serif. Save that. Our font updated a little bit. Let's give it a line height of 1.6. And then let's give it a background of E8, F7, F0, I think. Save that. You can see the background changed. And then let's say this container, so dot container, because that's the class up here. So we're saying dot container has a max width of 1100 pixels, a margin of auto, an overflow of auto, and a padding of 0 and 2 rem. That just moves it over a little bit. And that's it for the styling. Now, as for the actual components, there's going to be 3 components that we need here. We're going to have our to-dos component, which is just going to be our actual to-do. So we can, save that. It'll throw an error saying to-dos isn't defined. So up here, below this, we want to say, let's have some to-dos. Save that. Now it's upset because we also need to have an import. So here we'll say import to-dos from, and then we'll put it inside of component. Oh, I guess we could even say at component /components. Components /todos.vue. Like that. And then, of course, it will also complain here because this doesn't exist yet. So inside of components, let's create a new file, call it todos.view. And that should hopefully resolve our error here. But now we need to actually, create this todos component that we're saying we have here. So what does our todos component need to look like? Well, first things first, it is a Vue app, so it's going to have a template. Or I guess it could also have a render function or something. It's going to have a script with an export default. Thank you for generating that. And then down here, it's going to have a whole bunch of styles. Oops, style, which we're going to set to scoped. So let's go ahead and let's start up here inside the template. Let's say this has a div wrapper. So we'll just say div. It has a h3 that says todos. Save that. That gets rid of our error. Then we have a div with a class of legend. This has a span. And the span just says double click to mark as complete. Then below that, we have another span, which has a span inside of it. And this has a class equal to incomplete box, which just says, this span is equal to incomplete. And we'll give this some styling in a second here so that you can see what this is doing. And then we have another span below it, which just says span with a dot complete dash box. And then this will be equal to complete. So let's now come down to our styling section and we'll create some styles. Some of it will affect this, some of it will affect the individual to-dos. We'll say to-dos class will display as a grid. It will have a grid dash template dash columns set to repeat 3, 1 fr. And then it'll have a grid dash gap of 1 rem. That takes care of that. Next, we have an actual to-do. So an individual to-do will have a border of 1 pixel, solid, and it'll be set to CCC. It'll have a background of 41B883. It'll have a padding of 1 rem, border, oops, this needs a colon. It'll have a border radius of 5 pixels, a text align center, a position relative, and a cursor of pointer, which will just change it to the little hover on hand when you hover over something. So we can save that. Next, we'll need to set an icon, which is going to be position absolute. Oops, absolute. Bottom 10 pixels. This is going to be our delete button. So when we import a trash can icon, this is going to position the trash can icon in the bottom right of our to-do item. And then we also have a cursor of pointer for this. Next, we have our legend. So this should be where you start actually seeing the CSS affecting things. For this, we'll say this has a display of flex. Save that. It has a justify content of space around, which causes it to be sort of centered a bit more. And then it says margin bottom of 1 rem. That's just going to give it some fluff on the bottom. Now we can come down a bit more. We can say the dot complete box is a display inline block. The width is 10 pixels. The height is 10 pixels. And the background is 35495E. So that's our little incomplete box right there. And then we do the same thing for or that's our complete box. We now need to do our incomplete box. This is a bit confusing because the complete box doesn't have color, but the incomplete box does. And that's just because when you double click it, it gets rid of the color to say this is done. I don't know, sometimes it kind of hurts my brain because I guess you're never really happy with one option or the other, but for me, it seems a bit backwards, half the time when I look at it. And then we'll say width, height, and then background will be 41B882. That gives us our other box there. And then the last thing we have to do is a @media query, where we're going to say the max width of 500 pixels. .todos will be reduced to grid template columns of 1FR. Okay, that takes care of our styling here. Now let's come back up here to I guess the template area, and then below our div that has our legend, we want to create another div with a class of to-dos, and this is where we'll have a div that has our actual to-do in it. And this is where we're going to be using a bit of Vue, I guess a bit more than we have been using. Oops, let me do this instead. We want this, and then this. I don't know why this has another div there, but okay. We have one div, close, open, close, and then I don't think we need this one. There we go. Okay. So what do we need inside of our to-dos? Well, our to-dos have I guess another div. This should just have a class of to-do. And then inside of this, there's no actual content that goes between this except for, I think, our icon, question mark. But oh, it has the to-do title. I'm not paying attention. But what we need here is we need a function that says when I double click, I want to call on double click, and I want to pass in a to-do. And then we also need to make sure we have to-dos here. So we'll say v-for equals, and this is how you do a for loop in Vue, or inside of a template at least. But we say v-for, and then we want to do to-do in all to-dos. And this all to-dos doesn't exist yet. This is going to be in our store for how we're getting all of our to-dos from the API. So this is just our API request in a sense coming from the store. It's just whatever we get gets put in the store. And then here we're just saying, hey, store, whatever you got inside of you, I need that. Please and thank you. And then because we have this v-for, we also need a key equal to to-do.id, which we'll be creating in a minute here. Then we have our class of to-do, our double click. We also need a v-bind. We're going to say bind the class, and we'll just say is complete, and then colon to-do.completed. And that's just going to be what actually, this needs to be wrapped around in double quotes. That's just going to be the thing that's actually toggling the class, or that's setting the class based on its completion state. And then we also in here need to say, put the to-do.title inside of the contents of this div. And then we also need to say this needs an I with an @click equal to delete to-do. So this is going to be our trash can button with a to-do.id and a class equal to fas fa-trash-alt. And we can close this, and then we can close the icon. We can save that. Now we don't actually have this icon set yet. That is something else we'll have to add in a minute here. But right now I'm just scaffolding this out. You can see here it does still work. It's just because we don't have any to-dos, nothing really has the chance to blow up super bad on us. But now let's come down to our actual export, and let's scaffold out what we need to do here. So first things first, we'll need to import our getters and our actions, which are going to be, the getter is going to be our all to-dos, and our actions are just going to be stuff like, fetching the to-dos after an update. We'll be updating a to-do if we set it to completed, and we'll be deleting it. So those are a couple things we need to do here. We'll then also need to say, like, have a methods block. We'll need to give this a name. So we'll say name is to-dos. It'll need a methods block where we map some actions. And mapped actions always take an array. So we'll say fetch to-dos. And this is where it's going to start getting upset with us because these things don't exist yet. So now what we're going to do is we're going to full screen this a bit, and we're going to focus a bit more on the code while that stays in an error state while we scaffold this out. So we know it needs a fetch to-dos. I also know it needs a delete to-do. And I know it needs an update to-do. So those are the three actions we'll need. And then I like to have these on their own lines, sort of like this, and then tab these over. Then we also need to do our on double click method, which is this one we're calling up here. And we'll say on double click, I'll take in a current to do. And then I'll say const updated to do is equal to, and then my ID will be the current to do.id. My title will be the current to do.title, and my completed will be the not of the current to do.completed. And all I'm doing here is because the to do we have in our database, we know it has a completed Boolean. When I call the on double click, I'm leaving the ID and the title the same, and I'm just setting the completed to be the opposite of what the old completed was. And then from the store, we'll call this .update to do, and we'll pass in our updated to do that we just created. So that's what this action in the store is. And of course, with Vuex, an action calls a mutation, or it commits a mutation. So we call the action, and then the action commits the mutation, which updates the store's state. And then this will be fetching the to-dos, which is where, in our all to-dos here, that's where our updates are happening. So it's a bit of circular logic, but eventually it does all tie together. Unfortunately, some of this does require some trust. So for now, just trust me that when we get to the end of this, it will work. But now I'll say after the methods, we also need a computed block. And the computed block is something that happens where it just says map getters. Basically, this is something that is considered a calculated field almost, or like a watched field, where it will just be, if our to-dos gets updated, our getter will handle it. And then on initial creation, we want to say this dot fetch to-dos. So our getter is going to be watching our all to-dos, method, and then if that gets updated, it'll get repopulated back into our v4. And then when this component is first created, it'll call this .fetch to-dos, which is going to be the thing that makes the API request. So we don't want this to always be making an API request, which is why you use the action instead of the getter. Because if this were always making an API request, you could easily see how this would become an infinite feedback loop, where this makes a request, the request comes back, and then if you're not very careful with your logic, that might cause this to update, which means this will make another request, which might also cause it to update, and you can just have an infinite render. And that's an error I'm sure most people are familiar with from when they first started learning how to use Vue. But okay, that's our to-dos done. Let's go ahead and let's make this store. So let's come into our store and our index.js. And in here, we have these four little collections here. We don't need these. Let's just instead say this has a module of to-dos. And we're just going to put those items inside of this to-dos module, and we'll just import it from here. So we'll say import to-dos from @/modules/to-dos. Save that. And then inside of store, we'll want to say new folder, modules. And then inside of our modules folder, we'll want a new file called todos.js. Save that. Refresh over here. Let's see if it's I'm sure it's upset about a whole bunch of stuff, but there we go. This dependency was not found at modules, and I think that's because you would need to probably do at store/modules/todos. And that should probably stop it from complaining about that one specifically and complain about other things. Looks like it. Okay, so now let's come into our actual todos.js, and this is where our actual store logic will be. Now for this, we're going to be using something called Axios. So we'll say import Axios from Axios. And then we'll save this, but this does mean we need to come into our console. We'll stop this, and then we'll need to add Axios into our application. So let's go ahead and look up Axios npm install, see what the command for this is. And it looks like the command is npm install Axios. So we'll just say npm install Axios. Okay, that takes care of that. Let's go ahead and let's run our server again. So we'll say npm run serve. And then we can come back to our store. So first thing we want to do, let's create a const, call this our API URL. And we'll just set this equal to http://. And this is just going to be the location of our to-dos in our API. So we know that this is /API/v1/todos. Oops, and then semicolon. Next thing, in a store module, we always have a couple items that we expect. We have a state. We have our getters. We have our actions. And we have our mutations. And then at the bottom here, we also have an export default that says export the state, the getters, the actions, and the mutations, just like in the other store, but now we're doing it from this module. So let's start off with our state. What does our state look like? Well, our state is just going to have a list of to-dos. So we'll just say to-dos are an array, and then we're done there. Now for our getters, we know in our todos.view, and let me just close some of this Ruby stuff so we can see a bit more. We know in our todos.view, we have this all to-dos where we just need to have a list of to-dos that we can, iterate through in the for loop. So our all to-dos, we'll just say all to-dos. We'll say with the state, get the state.todos. And that's it for the all to-dos. Now our actions. Okay, so in our todos.view, we have our map actions. So fetch, delete, update. So we know we need these three. So let's copy them, come over here, create a comment at the top. And then in here, I'll just paste my list of things, and then I'll say, okay, we need a couple async things here. We need to be able to say async fetch to-dos. So our first initial fetch, I want to say commit, because it'll always take in a commit. And then I want to say const response is equal to, and then we'll say await our axios.get request. And what are we going to get to? We're going to get the API URL. And that's it for our get request. So now all we have to do is commit a mutation, or we set the to-dos. So we'll call this mutation set to-dos. And we haven't created this yet, but that's okay. And then we want to pass it the response.data. We don't want to pass it the response, but we want the data associated with the response. So we can save that. And then we want to come down to our mutations, and we want to define what set to-dos does. So we'll say set to-dos, colon. It takes in a state, and it takes in a list of to-dos. And then it says, okay, state.todos are equal to these to-dos that I got from the API. We can save that. Come over here. We're still going to get some errors, but hopefully our error count will go down the further along we get here. So let's keep going. Next thing we need to do is we need to say, I want to be able to async delete a to-do. So we'll say async delete to-do. This will again take in a commit. But for this one, it's not just a generic get whatever from the API. We're actually making a request to delete a specific to-do. So we will have to provide this with an ID. And then we can once again say await an Axios request, but this time we'll just say delete, and then we'll pass it the API URL plus, and then we'll use backticks here because that lets us say slash, and then if we do $ open brace, close brace, we can pass in an actual variable here. So that will say API URL, which is /todos, and then we'll say slash, and then the ID. So let's say /1. It'll call this specific to do. And then we need to commit our mutation. So we'll say commit, remove to do, and we'll pass it the ID. Then let's come down to our mutations. Say remove to do. This will take in a state and an ID. And then we'll say, okay, we need the state.todos to be equal to state.todos, and we'll use the filter function here. And all we're going to do is we're going to say, you know, check each to do and make sure that for each todos.id, it's not equal to the ID that we were provided. So we're basically saying every to do is okay except for this specific to do that has this ID. And then we're like, okay, you know, that's good. That is our remove to-dos. So what's left? Well, next we need the ability to update a to-do. So how do we update a to-do? Well, we come back up to our actions, of course, because we need to create this action. So we'll say async update to-do. This will once again take in a commit. And then after the commit, it needs to take in the updated to-do that we created in our todos.view. So this isn't really some magic. It's just this variable we created here that we're passing in. That's the one that we're using here as an argument. And then we say, okay, for the updated to do, what do we need to do with it? No pun intended. We'll say const response is equal to an await from an Axios request. And this time we'll say Axios.put. We'll pass in the API URL again, plus backticks / updated to do.id. Then we, of course, need to create our commit. We need to say, you know, commit. We'll say set our updated to do. And then we'll pass it response.data. And then we need to go create this mutation down here. So what does set updated to do need to do? I hope you're not turning this into a drinking game every time I say to do, because it sure feels like I'm saying it a lot today. But we say set to do. This takes in a state with an updated to do, arrow function, brace. Now we need to get the index. So we'll say const index is equal to state.todos.find index. We'll pass it a to do with an arrow function, to do.id, and make sure it's equal to the updated to do.id. Then we'll say if index does not equal -1, if it exists, state.todos.splice the index 1 and the updated to do, which is basically just saying, you know, splice it in and splice in the updated to do. Okay, so that takes care of all of our stuff in our to-dos view component, but now we're still having some errors. It's still not happy with us. Why is that? Well, if we come in here, you know, it could be anything. I'm not seeing anything obvious, but this right here might be a good indicator that we need to do something. If only we had a working to-dos app so we could, you know, make a list of things we need to do. We need to import stuff. We need to import our map getters, which we're calling down here. And we need to import our map actions, which we're doing right here. And we need to import these from Vuex. We actually need to do this outside of our export function, though. We need to do it up here. Save that. And now it's no longer super angry at us. So that's excellent. Of course, we're not getting anything here. So why is that? Well, no route matches get /API/v1. So there's a problem here. And if we open up our dev console, there's a problem here. Error code 404. No route matches that. So where is this issue happening? Well, it's clearly a problem with our get request. So in our store here, we have the get API URL. And up here, I'm saying API v1. I also need to add to-dos at the end of it. So let's add to-dos. And then you can see here we have our first to-do being printed on the screen. What happens if I double click it? Looks like we're having another issue. Param is missing or the value is empty to-do. And it looks like up here in our updated to-do, after we call this slash with our ID, we then also need to pass a comma updated to-do. We can save that. Now, if we refresh, we can try double clicking. And it looks like down here that properly changed something. But it looks like there's still an issue with our logic somewhere. Oh, I see what's wrong here. I forgot to actually create this class. So we're missing a CSS class called isComplete. And then we'll say background of a completed to-do is 35495E. And the color is going to be FFF. We'll save that. Refresh the page, double click, and now it's toggling as expected. So when it's 0, it's not complete. Right here, you can see it's 0. When it's 1, it is complete. 1 right there. So that's working as expected. Okay, so next, I'd like to say maybe we want the ability to add a to-do. So let's come into our app.vue, and let's say, up here above the to-dos, we want a add to-do component. Save that. We'll start getting some errors, of course, after it gets a little bit upsetty with us. And then we'll say we need to import add to-do from, and it'll be at slash components slash add to-do dot view. Save that. We need another component registered here. So we'll say add to do. Save that. It's even more upset with us. So now let's create this component. Add to do dot view. Save that. And then let's come into our add to do. So what do we need to do in here? Well, first things first, it needs a template. We know that. It needs a script. We know that. And it needs some style. We know that. Our template's fairly easy. It needs a div. The div will have a h3 that says add to do. This will have a class of add. This will have a form. It doesn't have an action, but it does have a at submit equals, and then inside quotes on submit. Let's expand this. It then has an input with a type equal to text, a v-model equal to title, and a placeholder equal to, I guess we can say add to do dot dot dot. Oops, needs to have a closing bracket there. Save that. And then this will also have a input with a type equal to submit and a value equal to submit. There we go. Next thing we have is going to be over here. We do need to import a map action. So we'll say import map actions from Vuex, of course. And that's because we're going to need to commit a mutation later, which means we need an action. So first things first, we need to export a name. We'll export add to do. Save that. Data will need to be returned. We'll return a title that is empty. Then we need some methods, which will happen after the data. So we'll say comma after the data. And then our methods, plural, will be dot, 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 map actions. This needs to take in a add to do, like that. And then we also want a on submit event that takes in an event. we need to say event.prevent default. Then we want to call our add to do action. So we'll say add to do, and we'll just say this.title, because it'll be generated with a completed set to false by default. And then we can say this.title is back to the empty string. So without that being back to the empty string, if I say test blah blah blah, I hit submit. Well, that just kind of broke. But essentially, we need the this.title equals the empty string, because this causes the text in the input form to be wiped afterwards. So that's the only reason we're doing that. But let's come down to our style real quick, and let's add some style for this. So for the form, we'll give this a display of flex. We'll then say the input with a type equal to text has some custom CSS. So flex of 10. It has a padding of 10 pixels. A border of 1 pixel, solid, and CCC. And it has an outline of 0. We then have an input with a type equal to text. And this will be an onHover, and an input with a type equal to focus. Equal to text that is for the focus. So if you're hovering over it, or if you're focusing it, the border will be set to a different color to show you that you are interacting with this box. So without it, if I click on it, nothing happens. But if I save this and I hover over it, you can see it turn green, which is a good way to say, hey, your focus is here, by the way. Next, we need an input for a type equal to submit. So we'll style our submit button. This will have a flex of 2. It'll have a background color of 41B883, of course. A color of FFF, which will set it to have white font as for the submit button. It'll have a border of 1 pixel, 41883, 883, 41B883, sorry, and solid. And then the cursor. So right now, this is what it looks like when you hover over it. We'll set the cursor to be a pointer. Save that. And now it changes to the little pointer hand when you hover over it. The final thing I'd like to do is I just want to say for the input type equal to submit, give it a hover, and for the input type equal to submit, give it a focus. And then if you're hovering over it or you're focusing it, we'll just set it to a slightly darker color. So right now, this is what it looks like when I hover over it. If I save this, and then I hover over it, you can see it kind of darkens, so you can see that you're, doing something with it. But okay, let's go back to the store real quick, because we need to add this action that we just called in our add to do up here, wherever it is. This add to do action that we're calling when we click add to do, we need to actually do that. So let's full screen this and come over to our store module again. And let's see if we can get this functionality implemented. So up here, I guess before the delete to do, we'll add in another one where we say async add to do. Add to do. This will, of course, once again, take in a commit. And it'll take in the title of the to-do. Let's put a comma down here, tab over. We can then say const response equals await Axios.post. We'll post to the API URL, comma. And then in here, we want to say, post, open brace, a new to-do, and the to-do will have a title and a completed of false. And then we can consolidate this to one line, put a semicolon there, save it. You could, of course, set the completed to false in the backend also. But of course, you know how to set a Boolean to default to false in Rails. Here, I'm just showing you how you could also like quasi set it to default from the front end. But maybe your front end logic might change down the line, then you could easily just toggle it here. But okay, let's go back a step and then we'll say commit, and we'll commit a new to-do, and we'll say response.data. And we're just calling it new to-do so that the mutation's differently named from the action. So let's come down to our mutations, and below set to-dos, let's create a new to-do. This takes in a state, the to-do. We can then arrow function and say state.todos.unshift, because we want to add it to the front. And then we pass in the to-do. So let's go ahead, let's move this over here, refresh our page. Hello again. Oops, hello again, world. We'll hit submit. You can see down here it gets inserted. And we have an undefined method to do URL for API controller, blah, 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 blah. So what does that mean? Well, if we come up here, full screen, probably doing something wrong in one of these. Yep. So in our controller here, after we call the create action, what we need to do is we need to say the location's not at to do the location, because we changed our path and our routing here. Our location's actually the API underscore v1 underscore to-dos underscore path. We can set that in there. Save this, refresh. You can see here it appeared. It was just an issue with the route it was telling us to go to afterwards. So let's add another one. We'll hit enter, and there's our another one appearing there. We see the insertion statement down here. All of that seems to be working as expected. Okay, so let's go ahead, let's full screen this again, and let's add in the ability to filter our to-dos. So first things first, let's come over to our app.vue. In our components, we'll say filter to-dos. In our imports, we'll say import filter to-dos from @/components/filter to-dos.vue. We'll copy this name, save it, come into our components, create a new file, paste the name in there. Let's come back to our app.vue real quick, and then we want to say between these two, filter to-dos. Save that. Now let's come over to our filter to-dos component. I'll move this back over. So if we're filtering, we once again need a template. We need a script with our export, and we need some style. So let's start with our template. This has a div. It says filter to-dos, and then it has a select. So let's create a select. And then we'll bring this down a bit. So our select doesn't have a name, and it also doesn't have an ID. But what it does have is an on-change call to a filter to-dos with the $ event being passed in. And then in here, let's create our option. So we'll say option with a value equal to 200, 200/option. Oops, option. And then let's go ahead, let's copy this. Actually, instead of 200, let's just make this like 100, 100. We'll say, oops, copy this. 1, 2, 3, 4. So say 100, 50, 25, and 5, something like that. Save that. Then let's just create another couple one of these. So say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just so we have a whole bunch of to-dos here that we can filter by. Okay, that takes care of that. Let's come down to our script. We then want to say import another map actions, because we're going to be creating another action to use this, of course. You can imagine it's probably going to involve filtering something. And then inside of our export default, we want to name this filter to-dos, comma. And then for methods, we'll say map actions and filter to-dos. And that's largely it for the script. The last thing I want to do is just style the select. So I'll say the select has a margin top of 20 pixels, padding of 6 pixels, and a border of 41B883. Save that. There we go. Cool. Looks good. Next, let's come into our store module, and we'll add in this final bit of functionality here. So we have our add to-dos, our delete to-dos, our filter to-do, and our update. So we're missing our filter. So right here between delete and update, I'll say async filter to-dos. This will take in a commit. Oops. This will take in a commit. And it'll take in the event. Then we'll put a comma here. And all this is going to do is it's going to say our const limit is equal to parse int, and then we need to grab the event dot target dot options, and then inside of that we want to grab the event dot target dot option options dot selected index. Let me full screen this. Selected index dot inner text. Okay, so that gets us our limit. Next, we want to const response equal to await axios.get, and we want to get from the API URL, plus we'll add in a parameter that says question mark underscore limit equal to $sign limit. Then we can hit a semicolon, and then the last thing we want to do is say commit, call set to-dos, and then pass in response.data. Takes care of that. Let's now come down here to set to-dos, and it looks like this mutation already exists. So you can see how this this functionality, because of how we've broken up this logic, causes some like unintended code reuse. So this is a positive thing, of course, because you're not writing the same function twice. You're not maintaining the same thing twice. You're testing a single point of logic in your spec test, and you can be fairly confident that both of these approaches will work for you. But okay, let's come over here. Let's refresh and let's see if this actually works. So let's set it to filter by 5. We then have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here. Let's set it back to 25. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it looks like that's working. The last thing I'd like to do, of course, is add in the ability to delete the to-do by clicking on an item. For that, we're going to need to do a bit of Google Fuchs. We need to say font awesome. And we need to find out how to actually add font awesome to our application. So let's full screen this. We'll say start for free. It's asking for an email address, so I'm just going to give it my email address. Send kit code. And here it says email is already taken because I've already done this. You'll then get an email that hopefully has a bit of code. And if we go back to our app here, we can then say, inside of our public index.html, full screen this. At the top here, you should have the ability to pop in this kit font awesome whatever thing. And I think if we save this, I don't know if this will actually work, but let's go ahead and let's check. And it looks like I do have a trash can. Now, I don't think that I have any extra node packages installed, but if this is still an issue, you might need to run an npm install for font awesome, but I don't think so. So if I check my package.json, I don't think I have anything font awesome in here. Doesn't look like it. So I think at this point, you're probably good to go. So let's go ahead and let's full screen this. Let's try shrinking the screen down to our 500 pixel media query. You can see up here, it's showing us how big the screen is. So it's shrinking, it's shrinking, it's shrinking. And it looks like at about 700, it forces it to be 1 to-do per row versus 3. So right around here, 750. Beautiful. And then if I want to delete one of these, I click this and I can just easily delete all of these to-dos. And I can toggle one, create another one. And then, of course, we could just mash, you know, empty to-dos because we're not doing any validations on the Rails side. But if I do this, we'll have a whole bunch of to-dos to filter by. Let me just do this a little bit longer. Okay. And then we can say 5, 25, 50. And I don't know, let's say make a 50 right here. Do we get any more if we set it to 100? Looks like it. So it looks like all of these are working as intended. So if I come down to 50, there's no hello world down here. But if I set it to 100, there's a hello world here. And of course, this means that this is totally expandable because, you know, we kind of just picked whatever number we wanted here. The Rails backend, the controller doesn't really care what the number is. It's just saying cast it to an int and then grab that many if that many exist, or just grab as many as you can. So yeah, that basically does it for this little Vue tutorial. Of course, one other thing you could look into, I'm not going to cover it in this video because I feel like it's probably long enough already, but you could do some RSpec testing on the back end. So for that, I do have a tutorial, which I'll have a link in a card somewhere, but you can do some RSpec testing to make sure your backend's working. And for the front end, we already have the specs in here. All you would want to do is just add in a spec to test your components and make sure all of your front end stuff is working as expected. But yeah, I think that's largely it. I'm going to go ahead and cut to the outro video now. Okay, so that's going to do it for me for this 20 in 20 video on creating a Vue 3 with Vuex 4 app with Axios and a Rails Sticks API and all the other crazy stuff we did. Hopefully this video was helpful. If it was, please remember to like the video. And if it wasn't helpful, remember to dislike it so we don't subject other people to more bad tutorials. Because when they see that this video got downvoted a bunch, they're probably not going to watch it. If you're interested, there are, I believe, 5 more of these videos coming. I'm planning to get them out before Christmas, so fingers crossed. But if that's something you're interested in, consider subscribing, clicking the bell, and all that other YouTube jazz people say. And after we finish the 20 in 20 series, again, hopefully before Christmas, there will be other content coming to the channel, so don't worry about the content ending then. But that's going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.